Beneath the surface of history, beneath the polished stories carved into textbooks and monuments, there's another truth, a truth older than memory and far more brutal than legend. Humanity's survival was never guaranteed. It was not written in the stars, nor granted by gods. It was stolen, clawed, and wrestled from the jaws of extinction again and again, until even the universe itself seemed to stop betting against them. Every child learns of pyramids, voyages across seas, rockets that split the sky. But hidden beneath those triumphs is the blood-soaked thread of survival, woven so tightly into humanity's story that even they sometimes forget how close they came in never existing at all. There were winters so cold that oceans froze and skies turned gray for centuries. Entire species disappeared beneath the weight of ice, and yet small bands of humans clung to fire in caves, passing stories in whispers because words were all they had left. There were plagues that stripped life from cities until streets became graveyards, and still, somewhere in the shadows, someone always lived. Immune, lucky, stubborn enough to keep breathing. Meteors had once split the skies, fire had once blackened the earth, and predators far stronger and faster had stalked the night. But humanity endured, not because they were the strongest, but because they refused to vanish. What the history books do not tell is how many times humans bent, but did not break. How many times hunger hollowed them, disease thinned them, war bled them dry, and yet still they rose from ashes. What the galaxy does not know, what even their closest allies cannot imagine, is that this survival was not an accident. It was a lesson written into their bones, carved into their instincts, whispered from one dying breath to another. Endure. Civilizations fell. Empires crumbled. Knowledge was lost and rediscovered. But the one constant was that humanity never allowed the final spark to go out. When the stars opened to them and they finally walked among other species, humanity seemed reckless, fragile, too quick to fight, and too eager to dream. But the truth ran deeper. They were not reckless. They were prepared. Every hardship in their past had been training. Every catastrophe a forge. The ice had taught them patience. The plagues had taught them adaptability. The wars had taught them unity in the face of annihilation. And so, when other civilizations looked at humanity and asked, "What makes you think you will survive where others have failed?" the humans only smiled, for they carried with them the secret history no one else remembered. Survival was not their chance. It was their inheritance. The revelation came not from a battlefield nor a council hall, but from a conversation that should have been trivial. A Xylan historian, curious about Earth's past, had asked a human ambassador why their species still bore scars of struggle even in peace. The human smiled faintly, leaned back, and began to speak, not of triumphs, but of the nights when the world nearly ended. They told of the time when a supervolcano choked the sky and sunlight vanished, when famine stalked every continent and survival meant gnawing bark from trees. They spoke of oceans rising and swallowing whole coastlines, forcing people to abandon everything they knew and start again on higher ground. They told of wars so devastating that cities burned until the air itself grew toxic, and yet out of that ash, families rebuilt homes with bare hands. The historian scoffed at first. Every species had their trials, but as the humans spoke, the weight of the words pressed deeper. Humans did not tell these stories with bitterness or pride. They told them with a quiet certainty, as if hardship was as natural as breathing. They spoke of surviving plagues that killed half their population more than once, of storms so vast that whole fleets of ships were lost, and of walking forward anyway. No miracle savior had descended to rescue them. No ancient technology had shielded them. They had simply endured, because the alternative was unthinkable. The tale spread. What began as a private exchange became a fire that caught the attention of the wider galaxy. Other civilizations began to investigate, digging into Earth's history with forensic curiosity. What they found unnerved them. The human record was a litany of near extinctions. No other species had endured so many brushes with annihilation. No other species had so many dead ends, collapses, and restarts. Statistically, humanity should never have existed. The odds were worse than impossible. And yet here they were, not only alive, but thriving, laughing, and daring to reach for the stars as if they had never known fear. For the first time, the galaxy looked at humanity not as children stumbling into the wider cosmos, but as survivors in an ancient and merciless gauntlet. It was not strength alone that defined them. It was not brilliance or numbers. It was that they could be starved, beaten, burned, poisoned, drowned, and shattered, and still they would find a way to crawl back to their feet. Other species evolved for harmony, for balance, for stability. Humans have been forged in chaos, tempered by disasters, and honed by loss until endurance itself became their defining trait. Some found this terrifying. A species that refused to die could not be conquered in the long run. Others found it inspiring, a reminder that fragility and resilience could coexist. And among the humans themselves, there was no surprise at all. They had always known their secret, whispered in every story told around fires since the beginning of time. The world had tried to kill them and failed. Again and again and again. The first true test came with the silence. It began at the edge of map space, where star systems flickered offline one by one. At first it was dismissed as solar flares, magnetic storms, interference from cosmic anomalies. But the pattern spread too cleanly, too precisely. Stations that had pulsed with steady life for centuries went dark without distress calls, as though they had been erased. The Council of 12 gathered in panic session, their holographic chamber a swirl of anxious voices. Theories collided, rogue artificial intelligences, parasitic life forms, weapons from forgotten wars, but no one had answers. The humans were not invited at first. They were still considered young, too new to the stage, too fragile to weigh in on galactic-scale disasters. But silence crept closer, and eventually desperation forced the Council to consult everyone. By then, humanity had already noticed. Ships returning from frontier colonies reported entire planets swallowed by a black haze that devoured communication, power, even light itself. What entered did not come back. The aliens argued for retreat, evacuate border systems, cut losses, and wait for the phenomenon to pass. To them, it was logical. Survival meant avoidance. But when the proposal reached human ears, their reaction stunned the chamber. "No," said Ambassador Ose of Earth, her voice sharp as a blade. "You don't survive the storm by running. You survive it by learning how to stand in the rain." The chamber erupted. Xylan officials accused her of recklessness. The Arklon called it suicidal bravado, but she did not back down. She told them of Earth's volcanic winter, when humans had lived through a sky choked black for decades. She told them of plagues that turned cities to graves yet failed to erase humanity. She told them of radiation clouds, of collapsed ecosystems, of times when extinction had seemed not just possible but certain. Every time, humanity had endured, not by hiding, but by facing the threat, by learning, by adapting faster than death could claim them. The Council laughed at first. Then they saw her eyes and realized it wasn't bravado. It was memory. Humanity volunteered. They would send ships into the silence, where no one else dared. Not because they believed they were immune, but because their entire history had been preparation for this moment. The others tried to stop them, but humans were stubborn. Within weeks, the Endeavor and 3 escort ships plunged into the darkness, their hulls gleaming with jury-rigged shielding made from cannibalized satellites and ideas sketched on napkins by sleepless engineers. The darkness swallowed them whole. For days, no signal returned. The Council mourned, muttering that the humans had proven their recklessness at last. But then on the 4th day, a transmission broke through, distorted, crackling, but undeniably alive. The Endeavor was inside the silence, and the crew was adapting. They reported the black haze was no natural storm. It was alive, nanoscopic organisms swarming in clouds dense enough to smother technology, feeding on energy, consuming matter, breaking down ships like carrion. The organisms attacked their shields relentlessly, chewing through systems faster than repairs could keep up. Any other crew would have surrendered to despair. But humans fought back with desperation, honed by millennia. They burned the air around their hulls with improvised plasma bursts, starving the swarms of oxygen. They rewired engines to release pulses that scrambled the organism's coordination, buying minutes of reprieve. They cut apart their own ship, stripping comforts and non-essentials to create makeshift defenses. And when the organisms breached and poured into corridors, the crew fought them hand-to-hand with fire, with acid, with weapons no one had designed for such combat. They did not hold the line perfectly. People died, but the Endeavor survived. More than that, it learned The crew discovered that the organisms avoided areas saturated with human bioelectric fields. Where humans gathered in tight groups, the haze hesitated. No one could explain it fully, but Zhao, the lead biologist, offered a hypothesis. Perhaps the swarm had never encountered neural activity like humanity's before, chaotic and unpredictable, and instinctively recoiled. The council dismissed it as nonsense when they heard, but the humans didn't care. They used it. They clustered sleeping quarters. They bled themselves into the recycling systems to spread their biosignatures further. They even walked outside in armored suits, their living bodies creating bubbles of safety that pushed the haze back just far enough for drones to operate. Every action bought them another day. Every failure taught them another lesson. Humanity did not defeat the silence outright, but they endured inside it where no other species could. Weeks later, the Endeavour limped out of blackness, hull half melted, crew battered and scarred, but alive. Behind them trailed their escorts, equally broken but unbowed. The galaxy gasped when they saw them emerge. The silence was no longer invincible. It could be resisted. And it was humans, fragile, reckless humans, who had proven it. From that day on, humanity stopped being treated as children of the stars. Even the most arrogant civilizations understood. These beings were survivors in a way no one else was. Where others calculated odds, humans defied them. Where others gave up, humans clawed forward. Where others saw inevitability, humans saw a challenge. Their secret history of survival was no longer secret. It was a weapon. The council changed. Slowly, reluctantly, but it changed. Humans were given leadership roles in frontier missions. Their methods, scrappy, unorthodox, often insane, spread among other fleets. Species that had once scoffed at humanity now copied them. When storms raged, they no longer ran. They asked, what would the humans do? And still, whispers of fear followed, because some realized what it truly meant. If humanity could survive everything their own world had thrown at them, if they could adapt to disasters the galaxy had never dreamed of, then what would stop them from outlasting everyone else? Empires might rise and fall, but the humans would endure, stubborn and relentless, until even the stars burned out. On Earth, children grew up hearing the story of the Endeavour, not as a tale of glory, but of grit. The story of a ship that entered the dark and refused to die. The lesson was simple, as it had always been. Survival was not luck, not strength, not brilliance. Survival was refusal. The galaxy came to understand, though few would say aloud, that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology, nor their armies, nor even their courage. It was the one thing their history had taught them beyond doubt. When the universe tries to erase them, humans simply do not go quietly. The silence had not been defeated, only pushed back, and humanity knew it. The Endeavour's survival was not an ending, but a beginning. While the Council celebrated cautiously, humans treated the return not as triumph, but as data. Laboratories across Earth, Mars, and Luna swarmed with samples scraped from hull plating, fragments of the organism still clinging in sealed containers. Where other species feared contamination, humans dissected it with the same obsession that had once driven them to crack the atom. It was dangerous work. 3 labs were lost in the first year. Quarantined, burned clean, their scientists memorialized with quiet grief. But the research continued, because that was what humans did. They took death, examined it under a microscope, and learned how to make it bleed. Soon, patterns emerged. The silence was not random but structured, like a hive mind spread across molecular dust. Its swarms were weak alone, formidable together, and devastating when merged into clouds stretching kilometers wide. But unity was also its weakness. Sever the signal linking swarm to swarm, and the haze scattered like smoke in a gale. Other species listened with disbelief. You can't fight a storm, said the Arklon chieftains. You can only endure it. But humanity shook their heads. They had seen storms break before. They had broken them. The first counteroffensive began when the Vigilant Star, a human-led fleet carrier, entered a border system consumed by silence. Where alien fleets would have fired from afar and retreated at the first sign of swarm advance, the Vigilant Star did the opposite. It dived into the thickest haze, launched squadrons not to destroy but to map. Drones died by the thousands. but their sacrifice traced the invisible lattice of communication threads that bound the swarm together. And once that lattice was mapped, the humans struck at its heart. They unleashed pulses designed not as weapons of destruction, but as weapons of confusion. Signals calibrated to mimic the swarm's own language. False commands ordering retreat, collapse, scattering. For the first time, the silence hesitated. For the first time, it broke. The haze peeled away from the system like a tide receding, leaving behind stripped worlds, but also silence of a different kind. The silence of possibility. The council convened again. This time, there was no laughter, no dismissal. The aliens stared at the humans with something they had never shown before, unease. For they realized this was not the first time humans had faced annihilation, and it would not be the last. Word spread of Earth's history. Stories long dismissed as primitive myth, but now recited like prophecy. The volcanic winter that had starved their ancestors, yet left them burning wood and chewing roots until the ash cleared. The ice ages that had crushed continents, yet taught them to build fires, carve shelters, and walk across frozen seas. The plagues that killed half the world, yet left the other half stronger, carrying knowledge etched into blood. Nuclear fire that once nearly ended them, but instead forged treaties, new sciences, and a grim refusal to repeat the mistake. Every other species had flinched when tested. Some had been nearly erased by less. But humans had woven survival into their bones. And still, whispers grew. The Ralic, a species whose empire spanned 6,000 worlds, began to murmur in secret chambers. What happens when the silence is gone? Would humanity stop there? Or would the survivalists hunger seek new frontiers, new threats to outlast? Even if they had to create them? To the Ralic, survival was not just resilience but dominance. They had ruled because they had crushed rivals. And they feared that humans, in their quiet, stubborn way, might prove the ultimate rivals of all. Tensions simmered, treaties wavered, the council fractured. Yet humans did not posture or threaten. They simply built. They expanded their fleets, hardened their colonies, spread like vines through cracks no empire had considered valuable. Barren rocks, frozen moons, asteroids no one had bothered to claim. Humans made them livable. With stubborn ingenuity, they built shelters in acid storms, farms beneath frozen crusts, mining towns clinging to airless cliffs. Where others saw waste, humans saw a chance. And the galaxy began to notice something unsettling. Whenever disaster struck, when solar flares ripped through stations, when plague seeped across trade routes, when pirate fleets descended, human colonies survived. Not unscathed, not without cost, but always with life clinging stubbornly to the wreckage. Their neighbors might burn, but humans rebuilt. Their neighbors might vanish, but humans remained. It was not glory, not conquest. It was something colder, older. It was inevitability. The silence fought on. Systems continued to fall. But slowly, inch by inch, humans carved footholds inside it. Where no one else could endure, they established research bases, outposts, staging grounds. Even when bases fell, survivors crawled from wreckage, battered but alive. In council debates, human voices grew louder, not because they shouted, but because their scars spoke for them. Every other delegate represented prosperity. Humanity represented survival. And survival, more and more, was what the galaxy needed. On Earth, children studied the silence not as a terror, but as another lesson. School books spoke of beside tales of ice ages and great wars, not as something to fear, but as something to overcome. The phrase spread across human space, a quiet mantra whispering classrooms, in bunkers, in command decks staring into the dark. We have been here before. To outsiders, it was eerie. To humans, it was truth. By the 5th year of the Silence War, no one questioned their role. Alien fleets followed human tactics. Alien engineers borrowed human improvisations. Alien colonies copied human redundancies. And still in private, those same allies whispered of unease. Because if humanity could outlast storms, plagues, and swarms, then what could erase them? If they could survive anything, would they ever stop? The galaxy was no longer asking if humans would endure. It was beginning to ask, what will the universe look like when humans are the only ones left to endure it? The silence war dragged on for more than a decade. Entire sectors became graveyards where stars flicker behind curtains of black haze, their light swallowed into nothing. Fleets vanished. Colonies with populations in the millions were erased, leaving behind only empty orbits where worlds had been. For most species, it was a nightmare too vast to comprehend. For humans, it was another test, on a scale larger than any before, but a test nonetheless. The Vigilant Star and her successors led deeper pushes into the haze. Every mission was brutal. Crews returned scarred, fleets reduced to half-strength, but they returned alive, where other species would have retreated to mourn their losses. Humanity treated each return as a lesson. Engineers huddled around wreckage, drawing on hull fragments with grease-stained hands. Scientists examined the dead swarm particles with sleepless eyes. Children listened to veterans tell stories of mistakes made and how they would never make them again. Humanity was not winning, not yet, but they were learning, and that was far more dangerous. The Arklon once asked a human captain, half in jest, half in fear, "What makes you so certain you'll survive this war when none of you US will?" The captain had shrugged, as though the answer was obvious. Because we already survived worse. We've been killing things that should have killed us since before we had fire. The word spread like wildfire. By the 12th year, the silence had reached the galactic core. Entire council races abandoned their inner worlds, retreating to fortified bastions. Panic reigned, yet the humans pressed on, expanding their reach inside the haze. Their fleets learned to carve temporary, clear zones, safe corridors where colonies could persist. These colonies were not comfortable. Food was rationed, power flickered, hulls groaned under constant stress. But they endured year after year where no one else could, and that endurance began to terrify. The Rallic Empire's envoys whispered at first, their voices tight with unease. They compared human persistence to a plague, spreading wherever others fell. If the silence destroyed the rest of the galaxy, who would inherit the ruins? Not the strong, not the wealthy, not the wise. It would be the stubborn. It would be humanity. Rumors trickled into the council chamber. Quiet predictions, then open debates. What if the silence was not an enemy, but a filter, a test of civilizations? What if it was meant to burr away the fragile, leaving only those who could adapt beyond reason? And if so, was humanity not already proving itself as the inevitable heir of the stars? The council fractured again. Some species argued that humanity was salvation, the only reason any of them had a chance to live through this war. Others warned that humanity was not salvation but inevitability, and inevitability was terrifying. For what force could stop them once the silence was gone? Humans listened to these debates, quietly, almost bemused. They had no time for fear of the future. They were too busy surviving the present. The final confrontation began in the Spherian Corridor, a region of dense star systems where the swarm had concentrated. Human scouts discovered that the swarm's hive structure was not infinite. At its center pulsed a vast cluster, a living intelligence woven from trillions of particles, feeding and directing the rest. Destroy it and the silence might collapse. But to reach it meant cutting through a storm so dense it could strip fleets to dust in minutes. The council hesitated. Some begged retreat. Others argued for caution. Humanity did not hesitate. They gathered every ship they had, military, civilian, even freighters welded with guns, and hurled themselves into the dark. The assault was chaos. Waves of swarm organisms shredded ships, peeling armor from hulls, devouring engines. Yet humans fought on, improvising every second, firing weapons until barrels melted, detonating reactors in suicide charges to punch openings. It was not elegance. It was not beauty. It was ugly, desperate survival, magnified to galactic scale. At the center, the swarm's core rose, a sphere of black haze the size of a planet, writhing like a living storm. The humans did what they had always done. They adapted. Scientists aboard the Vigilant Star unleashed their final weapon, a signal, built from every scrap of data they had gathered over 13 years of fighting. It was not destruction. It was infection. False commands woven into the swarm's language, a parasite of thought. The sphere writhed. It pulsed. Then it fractured. Across the galaxy, Swarms faltered, hesitated, and scattered. The silence, after decades of terror, collapsed. The galaxy roared in relief. But beneath the celebration, unease twisted. For it was not unity that saved them, not wealth, not ancient wisdom. It was a stubborn resilience of one species, a species that refused to die no matter the cost. The silence was gone, but the whispers grew louder. What happens when humans run out of enemies to outlast? The question was not paranoia. Already, humanity spread into ruins of silenced territory, colonizing stripped worlds, building stations where no one else dared. Their children grew up among wreckage, carving new lives from shattered stars. Other species rebuilt slowly, carefully. Humans did not rebuild, they expanded. They always had. And in the council chamber, silence lingered. Not the silence of the swarm, but a silence of fear. For everyone understood what had been revealed. Humanity's secret history of survival was not history at all. It was prophecy. They had endured their own planet's wrath, their own wars, their own mistakes. They had endured the silence itself. And they would endure whatever came next. Empires might fade. Species might vanish. Even stars might die. But the humans, those impossible, relentless humans, would still be there, crawling from the wreckage, finding a way to live in the ruins. The galaxy celebrated their survival. But in the shadows of every celebration, a thought lingered in the minds of all who watched them. If nothing can erase them, then one day, will humans be the only ones left?